It's a very particular moment in the art world that he and I witnessed differently. I worked in art galleries. He lived in Soho, and had so many friends who were artists. So we witnessed this kind of stunning late 70s to late 80s explosion of the market, and a complicated shift in the ground from feeling that the artists were in control of their histories and their work to feeling that dealers and collectors, and to some extent editors and writers, were seizing that narrative of attention. So he was a great friend to the community that he felt part of. He showed up. So one of his great traits was that he showed up for readings, and he showed up for people's shows, and he had things to say. And he was very engaged, so there wasn't that kind of withdrawal. But for himself personally, there was a I don't want to call it a withdrawal. I think there was a resistance to shifting the ground of his commitment to another space. It's very, very particular. It has to do with loyalty. It has to do with care. And I think he felt that in order for that to stay true to that part of himself, he couldn't go into this other stream, as it were. There was like this second stream that was getting bigger and faster and having more power, actually. But it's very easy to simplify or to reduce this conflictual space. I think it was not. He didn't make any decisions. And as I wrote, about him, he was ambitious. He had this very, very powerful understanding of what was good. I mean, he was completely clear about what he thought met a standard. Had a very strong sense of standards. It's not the right word even. It's kind of, because it's too judgmental, but he had a lot of judgment. It's a very particular kind of discerning. He was discerning about many things, about people, about objects, about art, about poetry. He had this natural discernment, I think I want to call it. I think I actually affiliate this discernment with loyalty. I mean, they're very close together in him. They're not separate spaces. And I think that for people like me who were uncertain about what the connective tissue might be in terms of a community or a group of people, what he managed to do was to extract from those conditions competitiveness. So the loyalty he had to people and to people's work was stripped of a sense of competing with them at any level. And in our generation, this was not so easy because there were these gaggles of figures who felt, at least to me, that they were competing and that they were having a hard time maintaining the idea of a community, which was sort of part of the notion, certainly around St. Mark's, that it was a kind of community space that then exfoliated into the world, and the world came into it. It was a breathing, organic space, and not a competitive space. And he had that sense, and I think it probably came started in Tulsa with his pals there, and with his understanding of himself inside of that place, and his reckoning, this sort of amazing subtle thing he did of reckoning himself into the idea of inclusiveness when he was this gay guy in Tulsa. He figured out a way to blur that distinction in a very subtle and supple way. I think that had something to do with it. This loyalty was something about trying to figure out what he cared about beyond categories. He was not categorical. And that gave anybody who came in contact with him a kind of release from thinking competitively and categorically, which was happening all around, I think. I don't know that that's so articulate, but something like that. He sort of made it possible for you to kind of align your own, to hope for your own values to be like his. He did do that a lot, I think, for many of us. A sort of, Kenward has this phrase, true blue. There was a kind of true blue quality to Joe that was utterly reliable. You never felt that he would let you down or turn away, or it would take a lot for him to give up on somebody or let go. That was part of the trait of this loyalty, this affinity. And it was very graceful. It was absolutely uncoerced. You never felt that it was there was no strategy in it. So felt completely unstrategic, and that again made him different because everybody was becoming strategic in the art world. There were all these strategies, and he kind of pulled away from that. He liked things, he liked wealth. He was very drawn to a certain idea of ease. It was very clear with him. But he didn't want to be, but he wasn't a bourgeois. To use an old word. He was not interested in putting his house in, making his house into something that people would come and go, oh, look at these beautiful things. But he loved beautiful things. So what better way than to find a way to buy them and then give them to people who also loved beautiful things but wouldn't buy them. So it was a very smart economy on his part, because his generosity was really to some degree to himself, but never acquisitive. It was a very interesting. Another way in which he was quite unique, that somebody who liked things as much as he did and appreciated them as much as he did, didn't seem to have them. And he was not at all critical of people who did want them. So that was the other thing, that just because he was the way he was didn't mean that you had to be the way he was. And that was another wonderful grace in him. I think niceness is an interesting idea. He was very nice, but I always think it's a kind of bad, flat characterization, because he was very intelligent, and he was very interested in making distinctions. So even though he was very nice, he was not free of judgment, of making judgments. That's the part that rubs up against this niceness. When we think of nice people, we think of people who are a little bit flat, characteristically. He wasn't. his relation to his own ego was very complicated. That's another way of putting that. He lived on Green Street, and I was working on Green Street for Joan Washburn, who was a woman who still has a gallery and has had a gallery for very many years. She had two galleries, one uptown and one on Green Street, and I was the director of the one on Green Street. And Joe would come by and visit me from time to time. One day he came to the gallery, and I was sitting behind the desk, and he said, "I have something for you." I don't think there was any occasion involved. He liked occasions. He liked birthdays. He really was very observant of passages of one kind or another. But I actually think, I don't think it was Valentine's Day. He loved Valentine's Day. Anyway, he said, "I have something for you," and he reached into his jacket and he pulled out this object that just looked like a pile of silver. It was just like a pile of silver. And he kind of poured it into my hand, and it turned out to be this necklace with all these charms on it. I was sort of astonished by it, because obviously he'd collected each one of these charms and put together this necklace. And I have no idea whether he put it together for me. I never got that impression, but somehow he made this collection of charms, somehow got this necklace put together, and then just gave it away. And I wore it for years and years and years. It was part of my sense of self, actually, that necklace, because it was a sign of this very particular set or constellation of traits of Joe's that were supple and complex, as well as totally straightforward. Sort of like all of the things he made had that kind of total simplicity and directness, and yet at the same time this folded in sets of ways of thinking or being that were not so straightforward. I think you can say that particularly about I remember, where you have this iteration of I remember, I remember, I remember, and as it goes on, it's a little bit like a charm bracelet, that the reiteration of the phrase I remember then brings forward into it all these different kinds of ways of constructing a self in a world that is far less simple than the simple phrase I remember. We used to go Christmas shopping together, and we'd walk around all of Lower Manhattan together to all these stores and buy Christmas presents together. It was one of the great experiences of going shopping with Joe. And we stopped at, as we always did when we had one of these journeys, we stopped to have a drink and dinner, and it seems to me it was a bar we stopped at for a glass of wine in Soho, and then I asked him about why he wasn't making art anymore or interested in that, and he was very clear. He just said there were two things that seemed to me to be on his mind. One was this notion that he wasn't good enough, and that was really interesting, because it was this idea that to be an artist, you had to be very good. It wasn't good enough to be okay. So that was the sort of sign that one knew of this standard. Actually, it's a better word than judgment. He had incredibly high standards. So he thought he wasn't meeting those standards. Morandi met the standards, or de Kooning met the standards, Warhol met the standards, but he didn't feel he had met the standards. And then the other part of it was simply about ambition and about whether he felt that he could manage that form of ambition, which would mean playing the game, the art world game, and he really had very little taste for that. So that those two things together, one, I think this idea of not being good enough was self-protective, and the other was in another sense self-protective. That it wasn't worth the price that had to be paid. And it also spoiled this joyfulness that he had in this notion that friends gathered in support of other friends. That was his deal, it made him very happy for that kind of thing to happen, I think. I mean, happy. Oh, it's also a word that doesn't really come quite right to him. It's like the flatness of happiness or the flatness of niceness. For me, he was such a wonderfully rich person, temperamentally. There's so many layers to him. His work has in it a kind of permission that is very, very interestingly related to the task. So that the permission granted it isn't like Ginsberg's first thought, best thought, anything goes. It's much more discriminating than that. And yet, the way in which he came to it was so without pretension, so without the architecture of trying to be something that he wasn't. It's so clear in everything he made that this relation between who he was and what he made was a very tight one, or a very real one, very taut one. But the important thing there to me is that it wasn't just that his own standards for what that looked like. It wasn't like anything Joe did was okay with Joe. So there was this sense of his own expectations of himself that were so high. So again, it's very important not to imagine that he wasn't artful. And I think he got some of that artfulness or that appreciation of craft from these people that he admired so much. He was a very, very astute learner. He looked at other people's work. He thought about it. He read it. He was not an untaught genius or anything. There isn't. I'd be very. One doesn't want to make Joe Brainard into a naive. He was not naive. He had a lot of innocence that was in some sense a kind of value. It was constructed in a way that Frank O'Hara and Warhol could both for a while be seen as kind of divine innocence, because something about the way in which they parsed or they made a connection between who they were and what they made, or there was something going on with that in that time, I think, between personality and the personality of the work. But I myself think that that Joe was in this other way serious about what it takes to be an artist. He didn't think you could just do it ineluctably. And that might have been part of his anguish, because he worked very hard. I guess that's the thing to say. But he never appeared to be working very hard at all. So there was that kind of funny mix. It was an interesting moment in American poetics, wasn't it? It was this withdrawal from confessional work that had kind of dominated the scene, the literary scene in the 50s and then the 60s, kind of making a kind of riot of all of those notions of bestness or importance or significance. It all got very confused, and for somebody in our generation, it was like a real kind of turn, trying to find some other way through. And the first generation New York School was amazing because they looked at a lot of things, not all of them American, and sort of set another constellation in motion. We have Barbara Guest looking at HD and reaching back to another kind of formulation of modernism, and of course Ashbery with this kind of deep immersion in French culture before everybody else got immersed in French culture in the 70s or late 70s, and then Schuyler, who I think really, and O'Hara, obviously with his connection to the art world. So that group of people made this very, very interesting nexus of connection among the arts, and wanted very much for poetry to be in relation to the other configurations of culture. And Joe was very, very conscious of that, which is why I think he did both writing and painting and drawing. He didn't really. There was that great moment when those were not necessarily separate arenas of connection, and you didn't have to make this kind of singularity out of your work. It didn't have to be one thing. As far as I know, he had no money. I mean, he came from a very modest background. He didn't inherit any money. No, I think he and Kenward fell in love, and Kenward is moneyed and also has a very inordinately dense, complicated relation to the fact that he inherited the kind of money that he did. Also a very generous man, but with so much more darkness towards that. I mean, Kenward's darkness towards the burden of his money became a kind of luminous place for Joe. It just got transferred. And I think for Kenward, undoubtedly, the fact that he could give Joe this much freedom or liberty to be Joe gave Kenward an enormous amount of pleasure. I think it worked for a very long time, not for the whole time, but it did for a long time. I never thought of Joe as rich. There was something about, he didn't ever have any credit cards. He only had cash. There was something about the fluidity or ease, or it was almost quite hard to talk about. The money itself seemed to have really no value for him. So the faster he could change it into a gesture or a meal or a gift or, his own splendid Armani jackets, the better. He had no, I think he had no interest in money per se. So that's another way in which this transfer of Kenward's having this complicated, historically complicated relation to his grandfather, Pulitzer. I mean, it's a tremendous burden in a way, and it was a terrible burden in Kenward's childhood, and so suddenly there's this person for whom there's no burden to it at all. That's the thing to me is the interesting transfer. I really do think that some way for Kenward it was such a relief to be around somebody for whom the money really in itself had no meaning. What it could do had meaning, and that could be done with this, you could almost say with irresponsibility, because he had the accountability place, the place where, how many hours have I worked for how much pay, all of that was sort of set aside. And so you got to see again, Joe was always, as I speak, I see there are all these kind of emblematic things like, if only we did live in a gift culture, where how much we make and how much we have in the bank and how much all of that was just sort of set aside, and there was just this cash that just moved among us, and provided other people with whatever it is that they needed at that moment. There's something exquisite about that, and again the way in which he becomes, for years afterwards. And actually, I'm sure I must have I don't know whether I got this from him, but I've always been sort of someone who buys too many presents for people and spends too much money, and whatever that means. And I think part of that pleasure in me was certainly, maybe I think I didn't learn that from Joe, but we shared that. So it was a kind of giddy space for us, that this disrespect for the actual stuff of money, much more fun to spend it and make other people happy. I mean, when you get older, that becomes problematical, because you really begin to think, what if I do get to be old? I mean, it was interesting that he didn't get to be old, because then he didn't have to have these new sets of anxieties about what it means to get old, and to have been frivolous, you could say, or irresponsible, or not care. I think Joe made you aware, this is slightly existential, I guess, that there's a natural buoyancy in the world, that the world has lift, and that if you relax, it will hold you. That's a sort of spiritual thing, but I think there was some kind of way, when I say those words, I think of Joe swimming, and this sense that our anxieties about the world, this is very privileged to say this, but I actually do believe it, that there's a way in which if we let go a little bit and feel a little less that we have to control everything around us, and everything about what happens to us, the world is very receptive to that letting go. And I think there was something about the way he conducted himself that had to do with that, with this sort of natural trust in the buoyancy of the world, of life. I mean, I think he believed that too, and I think that maybe one of the ways in which he managed to get clean was that he realized that he didn't need to over-endow that. He didn't have to speed that up or make it more. It was sufficient as it was. I think he actually came to that place. The generation we belonged to was really dedicated to the now. not really interested in the future, not really interested so much in the past, but really like saying, okay, we're going to make our own now, which unfortunately kept getting confused with newness, which is different from nowness. But I think there was a kind of real generational, powerful interest in the present. And I think that's partly how the interest in Buddhism happened. I mean, there's a lot of other currents that come in at about the same time, that make you really feel that the way to change history is to change the present in this very particular kind of way, alter the present, and then what happens afterwards will take care of itself in a way. There's that kind of pressure on the significance of the present for many of us, I think, and it did make everybody think, the older people, and now many people around that time, imagining that it was extremely irresponsible and cavalier, and without thinking about the consequences. All of the drum beats now of the deficit and so on, all of that about making everybody very anxious and depriving them of this kind of the amplitude of the present that we got to invest in. I mean, it was a kind of investment. And I guess that's another reason why Joe becomes interesting or paradigmatic, because that was so clear about him. He was present when he was present. There wasn't, you didn't feel this kind of the flickering of anticipation or the flickering of consequence. And I think that's in his work too. I mean, the work is incredibly, both the visual work and the writing has this immediacy of a kind of frontality, could even say. There was something very immediate and frontal about the work, and I think that you could correlate that to freshness. That the idea that if you really can make the present, you give something freshness. It doesn't recede. It doesn't historicize itself. It's a curious, interesting idea. That a lot of that I think he got from O'Hara. Place between memory, dream, and fiction, and how those three concepts blur into each other, and those three concepts then blur again into the notion of portraiture. I mean, I remember is a self-portrait of a very particular kind, and so the way in which narrativity or chronology actually happens in that piece has really very little to do with and then. It's not like something happened and as a consequence something else happened, although there are these sort of wonderful riffs inside of it, like you get like 3 or 4 or 5 I remembers that are connected associatively and chronologically to each other, and then there's a skip space and something else happens. And so the time of the Gertrude Stein talks about this. The time in the writing and the time of the writing is another blur space, because he's writing at another time than what he's remembering. And sometimes he allows those memories to connect up to each other, and sometimes they don't. And there's just a single. So the whole notion of narrativity in I Remember is marvelously deconstructed. And reanimated through this brilliant and very simple diction of the phrase "I remember." It alleviates the need to construct a narrative in the normative way of saying, but it also brings into the frame a kind of interesting thing about how Joe thought about consequences. If I do this, then this, and whether he ever wanted to think there were consequences to what he was doing. I think that's an interesting thing to think about. I don't have any idea what the answer is, but there is some kind of way, again, as this kind of paradigm of a way of being, you really did feel that he lived slightly outside of the boundaries of consequence. And so that was another reason why one liked to be around him, because it was alleviated. Somehow there was you go into this sort of slightly magical space where anything's possible.